Julia's personal life left much to be desired. She dreamed of a beautiful and passionate affair with an indispensable logical conclusion in the form of a marriage ceremony somewhere in Bali. But so far she had only tried to catch the bride's bouquet at her friends' weddings. And she was a real beauty. Julia was slender, flexible. Thanks to the gymnastics section at ballroom dancing school and a not-so-long-ago interest in horseback riding, Julia's face was not just beautiful, but interesting. Large green eyes framed by gorgeous piquant curved eyelashes, seductively plump and well-defined lips and touching dimples on her chin. Long, golden blonde, heavy silk hair of the girl was the envy of more than one friend. God had not offended Julia with her intelligence either. And it was not only in the diploma of art criticism and knowledge of 2 languages, Spanish and French. She had a lot to talk about. And Julia's wonderful sense of humor was always appreciated. She worked in the editorial office of a famous art magazine and, accordingly, was financially independent. But the relationship with guys for some reason persistently did not add up. And the guys, if you do not count the first school love, got some fictitious. One turned out to be an Alfonso, another 2 gentle friends with hot drinks. The third beau worked in a solid food company and provided for himself, drank only on holidays. "When I get married," Jay said. "I'm getting married in a church with my soulmate. No neighborhood registry office. If we're going to be married, it's going to be in front of God." Well, that sounded promising. Jay even introduced Julia to his mom. That's when she realized she was looking at a classic mama's boy. Julia never gave up hope of rehabilitating him. Alas, a mama's boy is a lifelong diagnosis. Jay's parent was invisibly present with him everywhere, even in bed. Whenever they were alone together, the obnoxious woman would call his son. And when Julia delicately hinted to the boyfriend that the phone can be put on silent mode, he splashed his hands. What if Mom calls? And that said it all. Julia's patience broke, and she regretfully pointed the mama's boy at the door, and then fell into a deep depression. The girl began to eat her condition with her favorite cakes. The consequences of such a bright protest against the injustice of fate immediately reflected on Julia's waist. However, it turned out not so bad. The incentive to lose weight has always been for the girl one of the most powerful, and the intense training in the gym itself distracted from happy thoughts. And then her classmate Inna invited her to the wedding. And she's healthy again. Depression again. Only this time without the brownies. Julia felt that she was beginning to quietly hate weddings and one day decided that she wouldn't go there again. A couple weeks later, her cousin's boyfriend proposed. Are they kidding me? Julia thought with annoyance. The wedding's in a month. And by the way, there will be some very interesting men there, and wealthy. Julia sighed heavily. Julia, what are you doing? Sister Hannah knelt down in front of her cousin and looked into her eyes. There will be a holiday on your street too. You just have to believe in it. Julia snorted skeptically. I'm already disbelieving. I guess I was born under an unlucky star. No, you weren't, the cousin objected firmly. You just haven't found your soulmate yet. You and your soulmate haven't found each other yet. Oh, don't talk to me about soulmates. Julia waved me off. You're wrong about that. By the way, the concept of soulmates dates back to ancient Greece. The girl sighed again. It's easy to talk about some concepts when you have a good personal life and a future spouse, the dream of any sensible woman. Dakota was a handsome, tall guy with an athletic build. He had his own company selling digital equipment, an apartment in the city center, and it seems a nice summer house. But most importantly, he was in awe of Hannah. In cold weather, Dakota called his beloved and wondered if she was warmly dressed. And Julia's classmate friend Susan? Her then future husband Anthony was not rich, but together they earned an apartment, a nice car, had 2 kids. Julia and Susan hadn't talked much lately. No wonder, because now her friend had a family and her own worries and, what the hell, new friends. Just as married as Susan. It's no secret that unmarried ladies aren't very likely to be invited to couples parties. I'm afraid you won't be interested in us, Susan replied to Julia when she accidentally found out that her friend was going on a picnic. Julia wasn't really looking forward to it. Why? To make her feel like a complete fool? No, we don't want that kind of happiness. And yet Julia felt hurt. It was obvious why she hadn't been invited. So she had to find her soulmate no matter what. What am I saying? Hannah was excited. And what if this wedding turns out to be fateful for you? Well, you're a beautiful, slim, interesting girl and not stupid. Where do guys look? Hannah continued to ponder. Not all men like a smart woman. I'd say only a few. I say believe in the best. Hannah insisted. A cousin's wedding was celebrated in an old mansion outside the city. The courtyard was decorated with intricate garlands of balloons and vases with some outlandish flowers. The tables for the wedding banquet were set on the second floor. It would be better outside in the summer, Julia remarked. But of course it's none of my business. We wanted to celebrate outside. As if guessing her thoughts, Hannah said. But his mother insisted on the second floor. What's wrong with eating outdoors? Julia asked, puzzled. Mrs. Nana thought it was for plebs. He. Lucky newlywed, Julia thought with a chuckle. And it suddenly occurred to her that there were advantages to being alone, like not having a mother-in-law. But when Julia looked around and saw that all the girls of her age had boyfriends, she immediately sank. Chin up, sister, Hannah smiled encouragingly. You're looking in the wrong place. And by the way, that guy standing by the pillar, he's got his eye on you. He's good, by the way. What guy? Julia asked incredulously in bitter tongue. The guy standing by the column was really looking at her, and there was interest in his gaze. Perhaps he could be called not just handsome, but beautiful. What do I mean? Winked cousin. Come on, don't get lost. You'll see, and in 6 months we'll be at your wedding. Oh, what a beautiful couple we could make. Why in 6 months? Julia asked. I'm just saying, Hannah said. Well, God bless you. And remember, you're a hell of an attractive girl. What's the use? Julia thought pessimistically, but put on the most charming smile she could muster. Hi, said the boy, looking at Julia with velvet eyes. Judging by his appearance, he was of Greek ancestry. Hi, she said. You have an amazing figure, complimented the handsome stranger. Thank you, the girl smiled. What is the name of the beautiful nymph? He asked. Julia. And I am Plato. The boy answered and kissed her hand with ceremony. So he is indeed a Greek, and perhaps a pure-blooded one, Julia thought. Are you a relative of the bride or groom? Plato asked. I am a cousin of the bride. Oh, is everyone in your family so charming, or is it just you and your sister? He smiled again, showing flawless teeth. See the lady in the lilac dress over there? That's my mom. You're kidding. More like an older sister. Well, I'm a good friend of Dakota's. Julia, I'd be honored if you'd sit closer to me at the wedding table. What impeccable manners he has, the girl marveled. Aristocratic indeed, she remarked with pleasure. At the wedding table, Plato courted Julia exquisitely, which struck her to the heart. This champagne is a real masterpiece, he said, savoring the drink. I've tasted all kinds of drinks, but this is the love of my life. Do you like it? Frankly speaking, Julia preferred red wine, but for the sake of such a handsome man, she was ready to love vodka. I love it, Julia exhaled. So let's have a drink on a bruderschaft, and finally, let's switch to you, exclaimed Plato. The girl enthusiastically accepted the proposal. After the bruderschaft, she met Hannah's eyes. She raised her thumb and winked. After a couple hours, the meal was no longer boring. The guests danced, laughed, fooled around, and had pleasant conversations. And every now and then they congratulated the young couple. Shall we dance? Plato suggested. With pleasure, Julia answered sincerely. After to a heartfelt composition, the cavalier bowed and said, Julia, and I have a splendid idea. That's how. She smiled. And what is it? And let's take from this fancy table drink and snacks and run away from here. Go for a walk. Talk. Julia hesitated. Plato was undoubtedly trustworthy. A guy like Dakota just couldn't have friends who were slackers. But wouldn't he find Julia frivolous? It's like a minefield. Once you make a mistake, it's gone. Something wrong? Concerned asked Plato. Julia did not know what to answer. Was not. After all, it's a holiday, and trying to outshout the music is a thankless task. Plato did not invite her to bed, but to a walk. If he is a decent man, he will not allow himself anything unnecessary. If he does, well, Julia will refuse him, and that's that. It's all right. She smiled. And I'll gladly accept your offer. To tell you the truth, I don't like noisy gatherings." "Same story," exclaimed the new acquaintance, and Julia thought that she seemed to have found a kindred spirit. Platon took the bottle from the table, carried 2 large bunches of grapes on a tray, a couple of peaches, and under the disapproving glances of the strict representatives of the older generation went to the exit, where Julia was already waiting for him. I seem to have compromised myself hopelessly. With a smile, Plato waved his hands, and the young people, laughing, went out of the gates of the mansion. They reached the square, sat down on a bench, and spread the trophy fruit on a handkerchief, which turned out to be in her purse. Platon laughed. "I didn't think of glasses." He laughed, and Julia also smiled, and soon they were laughing until tears. "How shall we get out of this?" Julia asked. "Well, to the table I certainly will not return," grinned Plato. "Good old men will not survive it." "Yes," smiled the girl. "So the only way out is to drink from the throat. If you're not squeamish, of course." "Is he laughing?" Julia marveled. How could one be squeamish about such a nice young man? "Not at all," she answered, and Plato solemnly handed her the bottle with the words, "First sip for the lady." "You are very kind," Julia replied. She took a sip. "Now it's your turn." "Julia, do you like art?" "I'm an art historian by training, but education is one thing, and love of art is quite another." "That's what he said." "I agree," nodded the girl. "And in general, yes, I love. Since 7th grade, I'm partial to landscapes. I like Shishkin, Levitan, Ivazovsky. His paintings are especially mesmerizing, especially the 9th shaft and the sinking ship. Emotions are just off the scale." "Yes," Platon agreed. "Recently I went to an exhibition and saw modern paintings in the style of Ivazovsky. You know, not worse, maybe even better. And I believe that there can be no worse and better," said Julia. "Everyone has his own style, so the paintings cannot be compared." "Also true. What do you think of the avant-garde?" "Honestly, I don't get it, unless Dali makes an impression. And in general, I prefer simple and understandable painting." She smiled, hoping to end this intellectual conversation. "You like things that are simple?" "But what's wrong with simple?" Julia shrugged. "For me personally, the key point is that it's beautiful, if we're talking about paintings." "And you often go to exhibitions of paintings?" Plato asked, and the girl mentally cursed. He had no use for these paintings. To tell the truth, Julia was at the exhibition of paintings only once, during her studies at the institute, and then as part of the educational program. But what can you do for a woman's happiness? So she answered, "Not as often as I would like, but it happens. On the 14th of the 14th in the local gallery is scheduled for an exhibition of a young and very talented artist. I'd love it if you'd keep me company." Julia almost choked on her champagne. Had he offered her privacy to talk about artists? "You were afraid that the charming Greek was infringing on your honor, and you didn't like talking about art. Maybe he just didn't know where to start. I'll be sure to keep you company." She smiled. The young people drank champagne and returned to the mansion grounds. The fun was in full swing. Julia caught Hannah's meaningful glance and smiled victoriously. She nodded and raised her fist. "You're a great dancer," shouted Plato as they danced an entertaining Latin dance. "Can you do Sirtaki?" "Sure." The gentleman approached the musicians, slipped something in the pocket of the chief, I suppose, money. And in a few seconds the chords of the famous dance sounded. And in a few seconds all the guests started dancing. Laughing, Julia exhaled after the dance, which turned out to be incredibly incendiary. "I've never been to such a fun wedding." "And how many weddings have you been to?" asked Plato. "Well enough," she replied. "And why not as a bride? And I just did not meet the one with whom I wanted to go to the wedding." "Exaggeratedly carefree," said the girl. Chuckled the guy. "I know you beauties. You look for a prince when happiness is right next to you. And when you realize it, it will already be given to another. I just wish I knew where that happiness was," Julia thought, but kept silent. Frankly speaking, this handsome man did not even think that a girl like Julia could be unhappy in her personal life. Well, let that be her little secret. But why should I choose a guy on the basis of what's good for me? Julia teased him, entering the role of a heartbreaker. "I want a prince." "Do I look like a prince?" Platon smiled slyly. "Yes, you do," assured the girl, and immediately afraid, whether he would not think that Julia imposed. Flattered. The guy nodded importantly, and her doubts were gone. Julia could feel in her skin that she was attracted to this sultry, handsome man. Besides, everyone she knew was watching them, and it was like a spicy spice or a sweet, warm wine that stirred the blood. Julia was in a pleasant euphoria. She danced, laughed, joked, and drank Bruder shakes with people she barely knew. "I hope you get lucky this time." Hannah winked. "I hope so too." Julia smiled. The main thing is not to miss the bride's bouquet. Her cousin admonished her. Julia didn't realize how the bouquet had ended up in her hands. She shifted her gaze from the laughing crowd to the bouquet and flapped her eyes in confusion. "Julia, don't let up!" Pam, Hannah's witness, shouted cheerfully, and the crowd burst into applause. Julia suddenly felt funny. She'd just caught the bride's bouquet and the guests were clapping as if she'd been proposed to in public. Wouldn't that be nice? Julia thought, cast a glance at the table and precipitated such bold thoughts. And then Plato came up to the girl and kissed her on the cheek. The guests cheerfully hooted. "By the way, dating at weddings is often successful," whispered the happy bride. "So, sister, go ahead." "Loneliness, of course, a bastard but narcissistic bore. It's a diagnosis," Julia said thoughtfully, taking a sip of her espresso. "Well, sis, you're a little hard to please." Hannah shook her head. "You look like you need counseling." "Me?" She smirked. "You're not confused, are you? Is it really that bad?" The cousins happened to be best friends. Hannah was friends with Pam, who'd been a witness at their wedding, Julia with her classmate Veronica, but each of them would have been best friends with Julia's cousin without hesitation. Hannah was trusted with the most intimate of secrets. If anything out of the ordinary happened to one of the sisters, they would discuss the problem at length, and then it would become much easier. Now, on a Sunday afternoon in July, they were sitting on the spacious loggia of the apartment where Hannah lived with Dakota, discussing Julia's breakup. The young people had been dating for a month, and Julia had to sadly state that no, not again. She had heard of narcissistic men, of course, but she never thought she would meet one. And this acquaintance, which had started out so positively, was not so pleasant. And if the young man is also a classic bore. A couple of days after the wedding, Plato offered Julia to meet in a cafe, which sounded tempting. The girl spent an hour thinking about what to wear. The cafe where they were going to have lunch had nothing to do with luxury establishments, so Julia stopped on a gray-blue pantsuit, white top, and silver platform sneakers. Elegant, democratic, and overall a great option for the cafe. What was Julia's surprise when she saw dressed in a strict gray suit with a tie? What's the big deal, after all? The girl thought. Everyone dresses as he likes, but apparently Plato for once did not think so. "You look great." "I think that the chest is too open." The guy just blurted it out. Julia already knew from Hannah that Plato's father was a descendant of an ancient aristocratic family. Who knows what it's like in high society, Julia thought. No offense. He smiled back. It's just that our family honors austerity and nobility. Besides, you're a very beautiful girl, and you don't need to bare your breasts. Yes, I guess you're right. The girl nodded and remembered that perhaps the guy at the wedding was simpler. However, a wedding is a wedding. Not probably, but right. He said admonitively, and apparently to make it more convincing, raised his index finger up. "What are we ordering?" "The donuts here are amazing," said Julia. "I'd like a cream donut and a cup of espresso." "Do you eat donuts?" he asked in a tone of voice as if it was not about coffee and donuts, but about some dubious drink. "Why wouldn't I?" The girl shrugged. "I don't see the point in denying myself my favorite food, and from time to time I like to treat my stomach with some delicious food. I just have to do it in moderation." "Well, a donut means a donut." Platon nodded, showing that his companion should not eat donuts. For himself, he ordered a Caesar salad, a glass of tomato juice, and a glass of mineral water. "I prefer healthy food," he commented on his choice. Can you imagine, he spent the whole lunch talking about good nutrition and a healthy lifestyle, Julia exclaimed. "Oh yes." He also praised his suit and emphasized how it suited him. "And dieting?" Hannah said incredulously. "That's the truth," she assured him. "Yeah." A few days later, he and I went to a young artist's show. All he said was, "I think the highlights are unnecessary here, and I think a cooler tone is more appropriate." And every time. Julia, what do you think? So what? Hannah shrugged. You were at the exhibition, after all. The man expressed his opinion and, by the way, was interested in yours. I have nothing to object to that. But when this young Greek aristocrat continued to examine me in the restaurant, I wanted to decorate his handsome head with a plate of pasta. Besides, he was again praising his outfit. This time it was a red club jacket, black pants, and a black shirt with white polka dots. What's up with that? It wasn't bad. But if you don't emphasize it like a flirt, I think I'll go for it, Julia replied. Hannah giggled. I've always wondered about such a handsome couple. So, my dear cousin, I am alone again. She sadly summarized and took out her cigarettes from her purse. You've started smoking? My sister was amazed. I'll smoke and what? She sighed. You should. If I were you, I'd go on an active search. Well, you did not succeed with this. So be it. You know why things don't work out for you? Because you're not really looking for love. And cigarettes ruin your complexion. How do you mean, really? Julia grinned wryly. Standing in the central square with a sign, looking for a husband? That's very original, by the way. Hannah laughed. She added seriously, You see, Julia, the fairy tale that love will find you on its own doesn't work anymore. Who will? Walking misunderstandings like your ex-boyfriends, and they will. But if you put in the effort to find the right person. Hannah was meaningfully silent. And how do you do that? Oh, do I need to teach you? The answer is obvious. If you want to meet a normal guy, be more active. Dating in a club, a cafe on the waterfront, or in a company? That, sister, is yesterday's day. You see what kind of specimens are practicing such dating. Julia thought for a moment. Hannah was obviously right. She had met Max the Alfonso at a club. The next day, Max invited Julia to a restaurant, and when he asked for the bill, it turned out that he had forgotten his card. He didn't have any cash, so Julia had to pay. Then the girl decided it was no big deal. It was a big deal. She paid for dinner, and Max would pay for it another time. But there was no next time. There was no repeat invitation to the restaurant. But the enterprisingly handsome man asked her for a loan. Actually, Max had told Julia that he had his own business, but it was just that all the money was in circulation. No loose change, he said. But I'll pay you back in a week. Good. Julia nodded. A week passed, then another. But she never saw any money. And when Julia delicately hinted to the debtor that she was not a millionaire, Max began to refer to business problems. A chance encounter at the supermarket with Max's classmate opened Julia's eyes. Why aren't you going to class? Asked the boy. Max's eyes immediately went wide. Your name is already on the expulsion list. Do I know you? Trying to appear calm, Max asked. The guy was obviously not distinguished by his intelligence, so he laughed. Max, have you been smoking? Once again, I don't know you. He cut off and, dragging Julia behind him, headed towards the exit. The girl was disgusted. Max, what was that? She asked. A man made a mistake, that's what happens. She pretended to believe it. When will you give me the money? Julia, I have it now. When will you give me the money? Julia insisted. Max hesitated and admitted that he didn't have any business. I see. The girl dropped it and walked away proudly. Of course, not because the guy turned out to be an ordinary student, and even a candidate for expulsion. There was hardly a person in the world who liked to be deceived. And after a while, Julia saw Max with a well-dressed lady in her 40s. The couple left the men's clothing boutique and drove away in a Mercedes of the latest model. It's clear, Julia thought. She'd been introduced to Jay by a friend. Jay's recently divorced, but he hasn't had any children, so he's not in danger of alimony. She told Julia she was his cousin. What was the divorce about? Julia asked. Well, the friend hesitated. I did not interfere in their family life. Oh, who cares? Well, not old. But who knows? Maybe you are made for each other. Julia's argument seemed reasonable enough, and the introduction took place. The day after the viewing, Jay invited her for a walk around the city, and the walk was more than enough. My woman should stay home, he said firmly. Julia had other plans for her life, so she saw no point in continuing the relationship. The girl quickly wrote a message to Hannah to call her urgently, and when her cousin promptly fulfilled her request, she left, referring to family problems. A short time later, Julia got into a conversation with their mutual acquaintance Victoria. And told that Jay beat his ex-wife, which in fact, and caused the divorce. With an alcoholic Andrew, Julia met at the birthday party of a classmate. She immediately noted his attractive appearance and pumped-up figure. Andrew also looked at Julia with interest. Handsome, isn't he? Intercepting her gaze, a woman in her 50s smiled. Julia nodded embarrassedly, and the woman said proudly, "That's my brother," and began to sing dithyrambs about her brother. How clever and kind he was. And then Andrew asked Julia to dance. They got to talking, and the guy struck her as a smart man. She wondered why such an interesting guy was alone, but the same could be said about her, a beautiful, smart girl. At the end of the party, Andrew walked Julia home and said goodbye. "I think we could do something together." "Really?" She smiled embarrassedly. "Well, why not?" On their first date, Andrew showed up drunk. "I'm sorry," he said, noticing Julia's puzzled look. "I had a fight with my boss at work, and I was at a bar with the guys to relieve stress. It happens." But the next day, Andrew invited Julia to a cafe and ordered a bottle of vodka. "Would you like some wine?" he asked. "No, I'll have a mineral water." The girl shook her head. "I'm driving." "Do you have a car?" Andrew perked up. "And what kind, if it's no secret?" Having drunk his drink in record time, the beau began to laugh inappropriately, throwing flat jokes and clumsy compliments. "Are you in a bad mood?" he asked, noticing the frown on Julia's face. "Yes," she said. "But it's easy to fix." Andrew smiled broadly and insisted that she take a drink. "No." Julia smiled strainedly. "I should probably head home." When she got home, she briefly blacklisted Andrew. Later, Julia heard interesting things about himself, saying that he was so handsome, hard-working, paid attention to her. And she, does not like that the guy had a little drink after work, and no one would marry her. The source of such unflattering statements was the very sister of Andrew, who was at the birthday party. By the way, the sister was not 50 years old, as she thought, but 30. "I see," Julia thought sarcastically. "Both brothers and sisters are not fools to drink. Surely the ancestors are the same." And finally, the aforementioned mama's boy, whom Julia met in a cafe. Well, and then where to get acquainted?" she asked, puzzled. "Presentations, city cultural events, exhibitions." Curling her fingers, Hannah began to list. At the mention of exhibitions, Julia wrinkled her nose as if she had a toothache. "What are you talking about?" Her cousin laughed, having guessed her train of thought. "It's just for example. Well, go to a camping site or a vacation home. The main thing to knock on all the doors, and you will be happy." "And what are we discussing here?" asked Dakota, returned from work. "Yes, we are organizing Julia's personal life," his wife explained with a smile. "I thought that soon we'll be eating salads at their wedding with Platon. But alas and ah, I see." Dakota laughed, and Julia realized that the attractive Greek had made more than one and not two attempts to arrange his personal life. "Don't worry, you'll find yourself such a fiancé that everyone will be jealous." "Well, thank you for your advice, dear Dakota." She thanked Dakota and went home. "I thought you were going to have dinner with us," said Hannah. "I made such meat." "Oh no, thanks." Julia said no. "I have to get the material ready for tomorrow." "I see," said her sister. "Well, go to work, you hard worker." The sisters went out into the hallway, and Hannah whispered conspiratorially, "I think I know what you want." "What do I need?" Julia asked ironically. "You need a vacation romance. How many times?" "Only resort romances were missing for the purity of the experiment." "What experiment? I'm serious." "So am I. Unfortunately or fortunately, work doesn't allow me to go to a resort." Julia waved her hands. "You have a vacation coming up. I've decided to use my vacation to start my own business." 6 months ago, she realized that she no longer wanted to work for her uncle. And as if by the way, she thought it would be nice to open her own art magazine. And a month ago, this idea became real, and Julia began to actively work in this direction. She used social networks, talked to the right people, and placed an ad to buy photos, but so far to no avail. Well, that's normal. Julia thought optimistically. And in the morning she received an email. It was the first offer of cooperation. A certain John, who introduced himself as an aspiring photographer, wrote that he would like to collaborate with her. Julia, without delay, responded and offered to provide work. Okay, I'll send the photos tonight. While she was at her sister's house, she received a new message from the photographer. It was the photos. I'll look at them at home, Julia decided. It's hard to judge from a phone anyway. Driving up to the house, the girl literally jumped out of the car. Impatient, Julia turned on the computer and opened the message. 8 photos, which seemed to Julia just a bomb, were sent as screenshots. And this is an aspiring photographer, she marveled. This is a real professional. With such photos, my magazine will put any other magazine under the belt of any poster. Julia wrote that she would like to buy all the photos. She opened the window and smoked. I should stop doing this, she thought in passing. Julia, are you home? She heard her mother's voice and hurried to put out her cigarette. At home, at home. Julia answered, feeling like a schoolgirl. Mariana entered her daughter's room with suspicion, turned up her nose and stated with a sigh, You smoked again. Well, what came over you? You've been living a healthy lifestyle, and I don't smoke at all. Embarrassed, Julia objected. Just the occasional dabble. That's where it all starts, her mother remarked. The girl wanted to answer something, but then the computer beeped, informing the owner that a message had arrived. Yay, Julia shouted in a voice that didn't sound like her own. Mom, he answered. He answered. Who? Rounding her eyes, Marjane asked, Did you meet someone on the internet? Well, you could say that, excitedly said her daughter. I got my first employee. Ugh. And I thought it was a fiancé. Marjane knew about her daughter's plans, and she thought it was a lie. Her daughter had an interesting job with money. So why tempt fate? A fiancé. Not just any fiancé, of course. But Julia had nothing to please her mother. It's better than a fiancé, if you ask me. The girl was a liar. In fact, she didn't mind a proper groom herself. But what can you do? If you're unlucky in love, you'll be lucky in business. With enthusiasm, Julia paraphrased the famous phrase and began to read the messages. John offered Julia to make an advance payment, after which he would send her the original photos. And then you transfer the rest of the money to me, he wrote. The terms of the deal seemed acceptable to Julia. Expensive, of course, but the photos were worth it. And the girl wrote that she was satisfied with everything. A few seconds later, the number of the account appeared in front of Julia, and she paid for the order. A good half an hour passed, but Julia still hadn't received any photos. Nothing. I'll wait. The girl thought and went to the kitchen. Her stomach had long ago demanded hot food, but being in euphoria, Julia did not notice it. What are we having for dinner? She asked cheerfully. Soup, Mariana answered. Super, approvingly replied her daughter and took out a plate from the cupboard. Well, how are you doing? Asked the parent, watching with amusement as she eats. Waiting for the original photos. Julia smiled. Half of the amount I transferred. Now I'm waiting for the photos and transferring the other half. Wait, so you transferred the money for nothing? Practical Mariana frowned. Well, why not for nothing? Objected her daughter. For samples of the marked photos. The mother only shook her head, and Julia felt a slight prick of misgiving. It was purely symbolic. But she didn't want to eat for a moment, and she rushed to her room. No pictures had arrived, so Julia decided to write to John's post office. But there was no more mail. She felt physically as if she had been hit on the head with something heavy. God, how could I have been so stupid? Julia thought with annoyance and cried with the despair of disappointment. There was a quiet knock on the room. It was unlocked. She answered. Julia, may I come in? Cautiously asked Marianne at the entrance. Come on. Her mother spoke fondly and stroked her head as if she were a child. Julia closed her eyes and felt like a little defenseless girl. Suddenly she remembered how her mother had stroked Julia's head when she was sick or upset about bad grades. How long ago that was. Julia's father worked in the Ministry of Emergency Situations and died in the line of duty. She was in 5th grade at the time. Mother and daughter have always had a good, trusting relationship, but after the death of her father, they became even closer. Probably both realized how fast life is. and the most frustrating thing is that it can end at any moment. That means you should appreciate and love those who are close to you. Beautiful Mariana had a lot of admirers, but she never got married. My dear mommy, Julia thought, looking lovingly at her mother. You could have made some good man happy, but you devoted your life to me. The sentimental thought made her nose water again, and Julia was also suddenly desperate for a world where there was no failure, no love, no men and crooks, a world of childhood. But alas, no time machine had been invented, or would be invented. Sniffing her nose, she thought and said, all my hopes and dreams have been dashed. Ruined like that? Marjane shook her head with a smile. Though she didn't approve of Julia's magazine idea, she wanted to cheer up her daughter more than anything else in the world. Anything to make her favorite girl stop crying. I'd been tricked, used, and I realized how vulnerable I was. Julia replied, a little calmer. It's like I attract failure in everything from a normal man to business. Oh, Julia, you silly girl, quietly laughed her mother. Do you know how many times in this life you will be deceived and perhaps even used? But you've had an experience, albeit a negative one. And you have realized not your vulnerability, but that there are many lies and deceit in life. But that shouldn't undermine your faith in people. There are good people out there. And God willing, you'll meet people who will work out for you. And you'll have a good man. Her mother's words had a calming effect. Julia's soul seemed to be filled with a life-giving force, and what had happened no longer seemed a tragedy to her. In fact, how many people fall victim to scammers every day? A lot, because no one is immune to it. The disappointment was gone. Thanks, Mom. The girl smiled through her tears. For what? For being so understanding, Julia said with feeling. Now we've talked and it's much easier to feel better. Well, what else are moms for? Jokingly waved her hands Mariana. Always at your service, please contact us. I even wanted to eat again. With a laugh said the girl, and lifting her mother spun her around the room. But it won't be a matter of that, cheerfully said Mariana, and they hugged, returned to the kitchen. Do you know what I think? Deeply thoughtful, said her mother, putting on the warming of the cooled soup. You need a good night's rest. Yes, I know you were planning to do a magazine during your vacation, but I still think you should take a break and start working. It's better to do new things fresh in your mind. I'll think about it. Julia nodded. There was an hour left before the end of the working day. It seemed like an eternity to Julia. She was tired, as it often happens on the eve of vacation. Besides, she hadn't had a good night's sleep, and now she was thinking longingly of a warm bath, a light dinner, and a soft bed with lilac-scented air conditioning. Grace. Too bad it couldn't be arranged right away. She and her mother had talked until midnight last night, and it had been great. If only it hadn't been so sleepy. The rest of the evening was great. It's been a long time since we've been so frank, Julia thought with a smile. And when she realized that she had to get up early tomorrow, Marjane said. Trite, but a fact. The morning of the evening is the morning of the morning. A wonderful saying, by the way. I'm sure tomorrow you'll look at what happened differently. And I was right. Funny thing is, it was on this rainy morning that she realized how true the saying was. Indeed, Julia had gained experience. What's more, she'd learned that negative experiences, unlike positive ones, spur you on and keep you going. Positive experiences are often relaxing. So I can only thank this John. With a smile, the girl thought, now I will be more conscious of my actions in social networks and try to be more vigilant in communicating with unverified people, and the money will come with it. A cell phone number rang. It was unfamiliar to Julia, but thinking it might be an offer of cooperation, she answered, Ms. Julia? A pleasant male voice on the other end of the line politely inquired. Yes, that's me. The owner of the pleasant voice introduced himself as a bank employee and informed her that her bank account had been compromised. Excuse me, what do you mean compromised? Julia interrupted, puzzled. But it was as if the young man hadn't heard her question. To protect your money, he continued with a clearly memorized speech. You need to provide your personal data and your internet banking password. And then Julia realized everything and laughed out loud, thinking merrily. Looks like I'm a popular scammer. I'm sorry, did I say something funny? Asked the supposedly bank employee. His voice suddenly became metallic and no longer sounded pleasant. Do you realize your bank account is in danger? I understand. I understand everything, laughingly assured the girl and disconnected. Strangely enough, Julia's mood lifted. She was pleased that she did not panic, did not comply with the demands of the bank employee, and, as a consequence, did not fall into the trap of fraudsters again. Go to work, you idiot, gloatingly thought the girl, and, looking at the clock, began to get ready to go home. On the way, Julia thought that it really wouldn't hurt to have a vacation, ideally at the sea. She suddenly remembered the words about a holiday romance. What could it really be? The thought remained unthought of. After dinner, Julia called her classmate Veronica, who worked in a travel agency. "You're a very lucky girl," she said cheerfully as usual. "Now we have good discounts on trips to Miami." "Interesting, of course, interesting," Julia responded vigorously. "I've been meaning to go there myself, by the way. Do you mind if I keep you company?" "Why would I mind?" she asked. "I don't know why." Veronica snorted. "Maybe you have some plans of your own?" "I don't have any plans of my own," Julia answered, "and I'd be very happy if you'd keep me company." "Well, that's great. I'll see you at the office tomorrow. What time is convenient for you?" The travel agency was a 10-minute walk from the magazine's editorial office, so she didn't hesitate to answer. "I can arrive at 1 o'clock during my lunch break." "That's fine," Veronica said approvingly. "We'll have lunch together." Julia found the prospect of lunch in the company of a cheerful Veronica tempting, and so did a vacation together. Veronica, like Julia, was single, but unlike Julia, she was not sad about it. "Fools," Nika said carelessly when Julia told her why she hadn't been invited to the picnic. "Don't worry, you don't need such friends who are friends not with you but with your status. Typical psychology of our women. If she's single, she's not worthy of their society. But you and I know who the real beauty and smart girl is." She loved talking to Veronica, so she looked forward to the next day. And when it started, she took advantage of the absence of management to sneak out for lunch 20 minutes early. "You all ready?" Veronica was surprised. "Well, sit down. I need to finish something, and you and I will go to the new cafe. The prices are ridiculous, but it's so good." Julia gladly lowered herself into the soft, comfortable chair and took out her cell phone. 2 messages from potential partners came to the mail, but this time the girl decided to study them later. Besides, it seemed that now they would come all the time, and Julia would not be able to answer all of them. And anyway, let the whole world wait, she thought nonchalantly. I'll rest, regain my strength, and then I'll start doing things. Mom's right. It is necessary to try yourself in something new with a fresh head. "Come on, let's go to lunch," Veronica said with a smile. The cafe pleased not only with the prices and delicious food, but also with the interior. It was homely and cozy. The tables were covered with embroidered tablecloths with flirty fringe. The seats on the chairs were soft, the backs high and carved. Porcelain teapots stood on the tables. The windows were decorated with smart curtains and filled with flowering plants. "How nice it is here," Julia exclaimed. "I don't even want to leave." "Yes, that's what I thought the first time I came here," Veronica nodded with a smile. "I often come here after work when I'm too lazy to cook." Julia ordered mashed potatoes and a cutlet. Both melted in her mouth. Veronica preferred spaghetti with chicken leg with sauce. The dish looked incredibly appetizing, and Julia decided that she would try it all. "Tell me how you're doing," the classmate said and inquired. "Are you seeing anyone?" "Let's put it this way." Julia tried to grin. "Not really." "So what went wrong?" "Everything." Sighing, she replied and told Nika about her brief affair with the Greek hottie. "Yes, it was a tough case." She grinned. "But nothing. We'll have a resort romance. You'll get new impressions." "My sister says that I need a holiday romance," Julia said thoughtfully. "And rightly says," nodded her friend. "Resort romance raises self-esteem. And if you are starting a new business, self-confidence does not hurt." "Why, do you have experience?" she inquired. "Of course. And as a girl experienced in this matter, I say that this is 100% effective means of raising self-esteem. Want to write a book?" "That's right." Julia giggled. "Tips for insecure ladies from Veronica's coaching. If I do write a book, it will be very soon. It was so nice and easy in Nikki's company, but unfortunately there was only an hour for the lunch break. Plus, she had to make a travel arrangements. "Hey, how about Friday night?" As if guessing Julia's thoughts, her classmate suggested it. Why not? On Friday night, Veronica showed up at Julia's in a dress that was more revealing than revealing. "Wow, bold," she said. "What?" Nika laughed, clearly pleased with the effect. "A little black dress. But it's not small, it's microscopic." Julia laughed. "Don't be jealous. Thank God the figure allows. Yours too, by the way. So this is our outfit for today." Nika winked. "I remember you had a silver one, and I think it's appropriate." "Appropriate for what?" she inquired, realizing that this was not going to be a one-night stand. "The dress code of the nightclub next door." Veronica waved her hands dramatically. At the mention of the club, Julia remembered her acquaintance with the Alfonso Max and wrinkled her nose. "What is it?" asked her friend. "Nothing, it's nothing." Julia waved her hand. "Well, then put on that dress." "We're going to the club," Nika declared, taking bottles of wine and fruit out of the bag. Frankly speaking, she had no idea where she had put the silver dress she had worn on New Year's Eve, and she didn't really feel like going to the club. But Julia knew her friend would never let her go. If Veronica had something on her mind, she wouldn't rest until it was just the way she wanted it. "So I'm going to have to put on a revealing dress and go to the club. I think I put it in the mezzanine." Julia remembered. The dress was indeed found there, and the girl put it on. What to say with such a figure could afford and not such an outfit? Actually, the dress came with a fur caftan, but in summer it was, to put it mildly, inappropriate. That was fine. All the more so because the dress fit perfectly and was to Julia's face. Let the men see and bite their elbows that they didn't get such a beauty. Suddenly Julia thought to herself. "I'm knocked out," Veronica exclaimed when she saw her. "Where do men look? Let's not talk about sad things." Julia answered decisively and went to get glasses. The outing to the nightclub went well. The girls were a resounding success. They saw the disgruntled looks of the young girls who must have barely reached adulthood, but only shrugged their shoulders with a smile. "Yes, imagine. There are such irresistible ladies walking around town, but they know their worth. You could see it in the looks on both of their faces." After dancing, they called a cab. "Girls, can I come with you?" One of the guys passing by shouted cheerfully. "Some other time, sweetheart." Veronica answered in a deliberately senile voice, and the friends laughed loudly. "We didn't go to the club for nothing after all," Julia thought as she fell asleep. "And I, silly me, didn't want to. The rehearsal was a success. Why don't we have a holiday romance? It's only one life. So we should try everything." With this thought, she fell asleep. A week later, the friends went on vacation. They rented a small, tidy house in a picturesque private sector near the beach. The house had 2 rooms and a fairly spacious kitchen. A shady garden and a gazebo also pleased. The apples had a mind-blowing aroma, and the gooseberries, plums, and grapes were so large that the friends wondered if they were in a garden of paradise. The first few days passed for Julia in a monotonous mode. Breakfast, beach, afternoon rest, evening promenade along the promenade. During the whole day, they communicated mainly with waiters in cafes or an ice cream cellar. She spoke a few dozen words a day, and oddly enough, she was enjoying it. The thought of a resort romance, although it stirred her imagination, appeared and disappeared. From time to time, Julia caught herself thinking that the thought made her uncomfortable. The euphoria that had swept over her after the nightclub was gone the next morning, and now there was no trace of it. But Nika wasted no time. The next day of their stay at the resort, she got up at dawn and went to the market for vegetables. And she met a burly brunette named Ray. For 3 days, Veronica went out with him. Julia decided to refrain from dating a member of the opposite sex. "Why wait?" Veronica asked in surprise when her friend told her that. "I have to make up my mind." Julia smiled embarrassedly. "I can't do it all at once." "Whatever." Nika waved her hand and started to paint her lips. "Look for yourself, friend. But you've got a lot to lose." Julia didn't feel that way. Not yet, anyway. Walking around the city appealed to her more than an affair with a hypothetical stranger. Veronica left, and Julia looked thoughtfully out the window, which overlooked the beach. There were moms with children and couples frolicking there. Where she left, she came back to. She thought gloomily and envied Veronica. That's who certainly did not depress the position of a lady without a beau. There are so many interesting men in the world that it is a sin to waste your best years on a single creature, she said as she closed the door. That's why I'm going to enjoy myself to the fullest. After seeing her friend off, Julia decided to take a dip in the sea. After the beach, she ate a plate of fruit and decided to take a nap. But she remembered that the door was unlocked. When Julia stepped out onto the porch, she froze as if hypnotized. On the bench was a gorgeous bouquet of obviously fresh-cut white roses. The flowers emanated a heady fragrance that evoked romantic thoughts. Julia took the flowers and suddenly noticed the card, which had beautifully inscribed on it. You are the most beautiful and desirable of women. Wow, she thought. Nika is a hot commodity. Julia was suddenly annoyed. Why am I really hanging around town? She thought and mentally said to herself. Can't make up your mind, you say? But will you? A couple of days before the end of the trip? The girl went into the house, found a vase and put roses in it. She looked at the flowers, indulging in her thoughts, and did not notice how she fell asleep. Wake up! She heard her friend's voice right above her ear. That's right, my dear, Veronica said imperiously. From now on, you're not going to be alone anymore. Tonight we're going to a restaurant. Ray has a handsome friend who's just dying to meet a hottie like you. See how sensitive I am? I found a date for you too. What kind of a beau? Julia asked. I told you, handsome. That's an exhaustive description. She laughed. Well, my dear, you'll see for yourself. And Veronica's gaze fell on the roses. So, her friend stretched out meaningfully. And I see you didn't waste any time either. Who is he? I don't want to know. Besides, I think these flowers came for you. Well, I don't know, Nika said with an intriguing smile. Well, you're the one driving the men crazy here, Julia remarked. And who told you that no one pays attention to you? Veronica grinned. Just because you walk around town alone doesn't mean men don't have eyes. Julia stopped talking. Is it really for me? The girl thought excitedly, and her soul was filled with anticipation, not of happiness, but of something very, very pleasant. Did you believe in yourself? Veronica winked. But you will indulge in dreams about the mysterious stranger later. Now go. Choose an outfit for the restaurant, and Julia danced her way to the closet. She wanted to look special, so she decided to work hard at it, and the result was worth it. Julia chose a bright turquoise silk floor-length dress with an open back. The dress beautifully emphasized the perfect figure, and its lush bottom effectively swayed when walking. After a little thought, Julia put on a silver chain with an emerald pendant. Okay, now for the hair. She twisted her luxurious hair into curlers and put her hair up in a high updo, adorned with bobby pins and rhinestones. With makeup, Julia decided not to make a mess. In such a heat, she had enough transparent lip gloss and some glitter. You're up, diva. And Julia walked like a model to her friend's room. What's up? Julia asked. Oh. Veronica exhaled and fell on the bed. I'm amazed. You make me feel like a milkmaid on a ranch. A milkmaid? She laughed as she looked at her friend's fiery red, tight-fitting dress. The bright outfit beautifully shaded Veronica's dark hair and didn't hide her long, slender legs. Come on, you are beautiful. When the friends entered the restaurant, dozens of evaluating male gazes stared at the entrance. There were many beauties of different ages in the hall, but Julia and Veronica stood out and drew attention. The girls walked proudly to the table where Ray and his buddy, whose name was Sanjay, were already waiting for them. He was really good-looking, tall, pumped up, short-cropped blonde. To her amazement, however, Julia felt something like disappointment. Probably such a handsome man, who, judging by his suit and expensive watches, was not poor, would be a wonderful option for a resort romance. But Julia was not attracted to him. That's all. She didn't want to have an affair with him, and she couldn't help it. Julia remembered the rose on the porch and tried to imagine who could have left them. Are you out of your mind, dear? Could it be some kind of maniac? Why? It could be. She didn't have time to finish her thought. Julia, have mercy on us sinners. Laughing, Veronica said. Ah? The girl asked, confused. Sanjay asked what you were doing, replied the friend. Sorry, she said embarrassedly. I was just wondering. So what does the beautiful Julia do? Sanjay asked with a smile. I work at a magazine, answered the girl. And how do you like it? Very much. With a dazzling smile, she nodded. Julia plans to open her own magazine, Veronica said. Really? Sanjay smiled, his Hollywood smile even wider. He's good, that's for sure. But it looks like he's not the hero of her novel again. Wake up, Julia reassured herself. It's not like you're marrying him, just a light, non-committal romance. But the more the girl persuaded herself, the more she didn't want to. Who made those up? Really? Julia confirmed and decided that she would not encourage this blonde macho. You know, guys, I've got a headache. I should probably get going. I'll walk you out, Sanjay said willingly. No, you don't have to. She said no. It's just around the corner, and you have a good evening. It was literally written on Sanjay's face. Are you kidding me? But Julia didn't care. She was now 1,000% sure that she didn't need any resort romance. And let Veronica talk all she wanted about how it was good for her health and self-esteem. Julia wouldn't do anything she didn't want to do. She was far from judging her friend. Let her live her life the way she liked. And Julia just wanted to love and be loved. She heard behind her as she walked a respectful distance away from the restaurant. Such a beautiful girl, and alone. Absorbed in her own thoughts, Julia just brushed it off carelessly. She didn't notice how close she was to the house. In the silence, she could hear the sea splashing, and the sound was mesmerizingly soothing. Julia stepped up onto the porch and almost shrieked. There were roses on the bench again, this time cream-colored roses with red edges. As she looked closer, she noticed that the stems were interrupted by an intricately woven gold chain with a pendant of small diamonds. There was the card again. This piece of jewelry is reminiscent of your beautiful hair, written by Mr. X. Please accept it. It would be my pleasure. Mr. Leroy. If Julia had had any doubts about who the flowers were addressed to, there was no trace of them now. Veronica had dark hair, which meant she entered the house and, turning on the light, began to look at the jewelry. White gold and diamonds. Julia knew how to recognize real diamonds. These weren't cheap. So her secret admirer was rich? It would appear so. She thought, his name is Leroy. Well, that's something. Julia turned on her laptop, logged on to the social network, and was stunned. Leroy was one of the guests on the page. So that's what you are, she muttered, scrutinizing the handsome, intelligent face. Leroy's page was not closed, and Julia enthusiastically began to look at the pictures. If the information he'd given about himself was to be believed, Leroy was 30 years old, 5 years older than she was. Profession as a businessman. Well, who'd doubt it? Julia thought ironically. And judging by his pants, quite successful. I wonder what his business is. Isn't it a substance? No, we don't want that kind. Leroy didn't seem like the type, though. She didn't know any of them, of course, but she had no doubt that they looked very different. The photos were few, but enough to draw conclusions about the man. A couple of photos in the office, one on vacation in Montenegro, another in the yard of the house. Leroy was sitting in a hammock, and near his feet sat a handsome golden retriever. The man lovingly rubbed the withers of his four-legged pet and smiled into the frame. He loves animals, Julia stated, and that characterizes him as a good, kind man. And here's a photo of him on the beach. Leroy, although not a jock, was not badly built. He probably went to the gym from time to time, to the pool. In short, he did everything he could to keep himself in shape. Suddenly a message arrived, and Julia, trembling with excitement, opened it immediately. There you are, my enchanting lady, she read. Shall we not get to know each other better? Julia wondered. Did she want to get to know him better? Yes, she decided. She could literally feel in her skin that everything would be fine. Why not? She wrote and added a winking smiley face to her reply. That's great, Leroy replied. I'll write the time and address tomorrow. Julia turned off the laptop, went to bed, but sleep did not come. All the girl's thoughts were about the mysterious Leroy. Julia suddenly imagined them kissing, and the thought made her shiver. I wonder how he figured me out, the girl thought and fell sound asleep. What time did you get back? Julia asked when Veronica entered her room. She was wearing a short, translucent robe and house shoes with small heels, decorated with fur tips. How beautiful Nika is after all, Julia thought. Of course she was no worse, but Unlike her friend, she didn't know how to wear such things. Perhaps it would be worth learning. She decided. I don't know, answered Veronica. What's gotten into you? What's gotten into me? Julia shrugged. Well, I didn't like this, Sanjay. What's wrong? I don't know what's wrong with you, thoughtfully said her classmate. Then you dream of a beautiful romance. Then you flee from a handsome, wealthy man. And if not? Julia smiled enigmatically. I don't get it, perplexed Veronica. Did you pick up someone on the way? Julia, tell me. But she wanted to intrigue her friend a little. Something like that, Julia answered. Julia, what are you doing? She asked innocently. You know I don't like to beat around the bush. I know. Julia nodded and pointed to the new flowers. Veronica sat down on the bed and said, Tell me. Julia, you're crazy, Nika declared. After listening to her friend's story, a rich, handsome man liked you, but you backed out. And then you saw flowers and diamonds and went for it. Sanjay would have showered you with diamonds? What's that got to do with it? Julia sighed. What does that have to do with anything? I don't know, admitted the girl. But something tells me it is. What is it? That's it. You mean love? Maybe. I don't understand you. Veronica shook her head. What kind of love could there be? What if it's not true at all? And the flowers and the necklace, also a lie? Julia said reasonably. I'm not talking about the flowers and the chain, but about the one who presented them. Are you sure he's an honest businessman? I'm not sure of anything. She sighed and suddenly winked at her friend. But it can be checked, can it? A gamble. Veronica smiled. You could say that. Julia agreed. And she realized that now her friend would support her, because Nika loved adventures, and therefore would show understanding, would stop crying about all the lies and rejected Sanjay. The math was right. You know, there is something in it. She smiled. But I still think you should be on the safe side. You don't know this man, and you don't know what he's going to do. Yes, but how to do it? It's elementary, Veronica exclaimed. You'll send me the address if something goes wrong. Send me the word SOS on Messenger, or an exclamation point, and then Ray and I will rush to your aid. The girls laughed. After lunch, Leroy sent his coordinates. I think it's at the end of the next street. Julia, who had gone all around the neighborhood, realized. Yes, it's right there. Wait. Veronica's eyes rounded. So it's next door to the woman who rented us the house. The friends looked at each other and, without collusion, exclaimed, So that's what it turns out to be? They fell silent. It turns out that she kindly gave her neighbor your data. Veronica nodded, regaining the power of speech. It turns out. But she gives the impression of a decent woman, and I don't think she would give her neighbor's number to some scoundrel. Nika reasoned cheerfully, as if she hadn't been the one to be skeptical about her friend's idea of meeting Leroy 20 minutes ago. So, Julia, let's get you ready for your date with the mysterious stranger. Where do we start? Julia asked in a businesslike manner. First, we'll go to the sea. The same businesslike tone, replied Veronica. We'll freshen up. The beach was a 10-minute walk away, which greatly affected the cost of renting the house. But the friends reasoned that it was better to pay more, but in the end they would get everything they needed. The sight of the dazzling blue seawater always calmed Julia and put her in a positive mood, which was especially important on a day like this. She could feel the rapturous glances of the men, and the thought crept into her head that perhaps Leroy was among them, secretly watching her. The thought seemed exciting to Julia, and she decided to show herself in all her glory. Freed from her dress and t-shirt, she strode gracefully to the water and plunged in. Leaving the shore about 20 meters away, Julia rolled over on her back and spread her arms. The warm seawater pierced every cell of her body. The sea had always given Julia an unprecedented bliss and sense of freedom, but at this moment she felt its life-giving power more than ever, and the anticipation of long-awaited happiness heightened the amazing sensation she felt at that blessed moment. In her ecstasy, Julia didn't notice Veronica beside her. You look very special tonight, she remarked. You know, I can feel it, Julia replied with a smile. I feel better today than ever, and you're a romantic lady. Nika smiled back and shook her head. Is that good or bad? Asked the romantic lady. It's wonderful, assured her friend. They swam to the shore. When the girls reached the shore, Julia unraveled her luxurious curls and shook them, making a few men who were a little further away freeze with admiration. "Look while you can." Julia took sunscreen out of her beach bag and began to slowly rub it into her skin. The men literally craned their necks. Such talent is wasted. With a slight smile looking at her, said Veronica. "Why should it be lost?" Julia argued. "I'm using it for its intended purpose. You haven't changed your mind about going to meet your Romeo yet?" "No," she replied succinctly, putting the tube of cream back in her purse and rolling over onto her back. Having bathed once more, Julia and Nika began to pack up for the house. The next item on the plan was an impromptu spa treatment in a small sauna and a cold shower. It would be nice to give you a massage after the treatments. But what I don't know. Veronica waved her hands. "What's rich? What's good for you?" After the treatment, Julia felt like a newborn. Or maybe this was her new birth. Julia decided not to get fancy with her hair or makeup. Her hair after the nourishing mask looked like a golden silk shawl, and Julia decided that it was a sin to hide such beauty, so she decided to leave her hair loose. Same with her makeup. The spa treatment was a miracle. Julia's skin seemed to be illuminated from within and didn't need any makeup, except a little bit of clear gloss. In the morning, she'd put on a short white dress with open shoulders and earned another round of applause from her friend. If only Leroy could appreciate their efforts together. "Shall I walk you out?" Veronica suggested. "No, I don't need to." Julia shook her head with a smile and winked. "You've already spent 12 hours with me, and you've got a guest to meet. You know everything." She giggled. Julia walked toward Leroy's house, her legs shaking. Her heart was beating as if she were running, and when Julia arrived at the right address, she suddenly wanted to go back. To come at night to a complete stranger and 1,000 kilometers away from home was a real madness. Julia stood next to the beautiful house and thought about what to do. To leave, of course, is easy, but the girl felt that this is not worth doing, and she mentally crossed herself, resolutely approached the fence and pressed the call button. "Who?" asked a male voice with a hoarseness. Yes, it wasn't what Julia had imagined the voice of a young businessman to sound like. But maybe he just smoked a lot. God, what nonsense is going through my head? Julia was angry with herself. I'm Julia. I'll get it. A couple of minutes later, the gates opened in different directions, and the girl freely entered the territory. There's nowhere to retreat, she thought as she climbed the steps. The door of the house swung open, and Julia saw an old grandfather, a real grandfather in his 60s. The disappointment was so great that she almost sobbed. Her first thought was to leave. But remembering that Veronica was now with Ray, she abandoned that thought. Grandfather was bustling about, and she felt uncomfortable turning around and leaving. Come in, Julia. The older man thanked her. I'm Mr. Leroy. You can just call me Leroy. Nice to meet you. The girl squeezed herself out. Likewise, mutually. The grandfather spoke in a low voice and, embracing her delicately, led her down the corridor. Please, cheerfully proclaimed the old man, opening the door. The first thing Julia saw was a richly set table. In the middle of the table was a platter of goose, covered with slices of golden potatoes and slices of apples. There were salads, of which there were 5 kinds, and of course the local fruits and a huge bottle of homemade wine. Julia was suddenly embarrassed. The man had worked hard, cooked, set the table. Aha! And he was writing on behalf of a young man. And you, fool, believed it, the inner voice said mockingly. Come on, Grandpa must be bored. So he decided to brighten his loneliness. Oh, to get drunk in the company of my grandfather. That's my lot. Julia sat down at the table, and Leroy began to court her gallantly. How about some grape wine? He inquired. I assure you it's marvelous. I assure you it's marvelous, Julia replied with a smile. I'd love to have some wine. That's what we call it, the older man said approvingly and poured her a large glass of wine. The drink emanated such a wonderful aroma that Julia wanted to take a sip immediately. But since it was indecent, the girl waited patiently for the first toast. Julia, what kind of salad do you like? Leroy asked. Of all the things I see here, all of them. That's great. He rejoiced and put a little of each on the girl's plate. How delicious, sincerely said Julia, tasting the Greek salad. Eat it. For me, the best reward is when a guest likes my food." The girl scrutinized the host and found him to be quite an attractive older man. A charming elderly gentleman, he must have been irresistible in his youth, she thought. All the girls were his. "Well done, Julia. Let me make the first toast to you," Leroy said with feeling. "And it is accepted," cheerfully supported his guest. The taste of the wine was truly luxurious. "Do you like it?" Slyly glancing at Julia, the man asked. "Very much. I made it myself." He bragged. "That's great. Julia, where are you from if it's no secret? Didn't Mrs. Clara tell you?" The girl grinned mentally but aloud only named her town. "I see. Julia, what do you do?" Julia suddenly remembered her failed suitor Sanjay, and she was surprised to realize that this smiling old man made a much more favorable impression on her. "Maybe I like older men, but I don't realize it yet," Julia wondered. "I am an art historian by education. I work in an art magazine." Smiling sweetly, she answered. "What kind of art magazine?" "Harmony. I know it." Leroy nodded, which surprised Julia. In her mind, businessmen were pragmatic people to whom art was completely alien. "It's a good magazine." "Are you interested in art?" "Yes, I am." "What kind of art?" "A little of everything." The older gentleman smiled. "Julia, would you like me to sing to you?" He'll probably start to serenade her. The girl decided. "Well, why not? Sing." Julia nodded. Leroy immediately got up from the table and went to the middle of the dining room. If he spoke with a hoarseness, when singing he had a rather pleasant baritone. What was it? Leroy's pleasant voice was enveloping, mesmerizing. He sang in Sanskrit. The language had long ago been considered dead, and Julia was surprised to find someone singing in it, especially a businessman. It was a beautiful song about the forbidden love of a beggar shepherd for a noble lady. And Julia listened. And when the song ended, the girl applauded. "Bravo!" she exclaimed. "It's simply marvelous." Julia could not find the right words to express her delight, but Leroy was flattered by this simple praise. The old man smiled. Probably to hide his embarrassment, he offered to drink to the art. "With pleasure," Julia exclaimed and thought. "He's a nice old man. I think I'm going to visit him. I should give him back his necklace, or God forbid they think I'm using him for mercantile purposes. Here." Just then, a golden retriever came running into the room, the same dog Julia had seen in a photo on social media. But that was just the beginning. A young man entered the room with a bouquet of scarlet roses. "I see that you have already found a common language," he said with a smile, and looking carefully at the amazed Julia, added, "And you are even more beautiful up close." "Wait a minute," she said and rubbed her temples. "Which one of you is Leroy?" "Both of you." The men answered with glee and laughed loudly. Leroy was a handsome, smart, but too shy guy. This caused him a lot of problems in his relationships with girls. He couldn't approach a girl he liked, and when someone else did, the guy only had to suffer in silence. The thing was also that Leroy was a romantic guy, and modern beauties did not understand this. Those who are bolder, and this as a rule were older girls, tried to approach the young handsome. But all as one failed. The guy did not understand this. He was sure that the first step should be made by a young man, and no other way. Especially depressing that the first beauty of the class which dreamed of him every night was friends with a bully and a bigot. And all because Leroy had never been able to say how he felt. Leroy since the 9th grade dreamed of business, so he decided to enter the Faculty of Economics, which he did after graduation. The guy liked studying very much, but in terms of personal life at the university was the same as at school. There were plenty of beautiful girls, but still lacked the courage to approach one of them. Leroy didn't even notice the moment when he was seized by autumn moping. He just noticed that the days were getting shorter, the weather was getting colder, and his mood was slowly but surely deteriorating. Leroy constantly felt tired and apathetic. The autumn landscape, although beautiful, seemed dull and lifelike to him. "You urgently need to meet a cool girl," summarized a new friend of his classmate. "It's not a problem in the dorm. How many of them there are in short robes." At one of the student parties he got close to the first beauty. Amazingly, but in the morning there was no trace of fall moping. A date with a beautiful girl shook Leroy up. He felt like he was flying on wings. That was until Leroy saw that girl drive up to the dormitory with some rich guy in a cool foreign car. He timidly demanded an explanation, but the girl only shrugged and said, "This is my admirer. So what of it? You're handsome, smart, and I really like you. And Jack is rich." And smiling, she added, "You and he complement each other so nicely." But Leroy didn't need to compliment anyone, and he didn't need any compliments himself. So Leroy silently turned around and walked away. At that moment, something clicked in his brain. "Stop being a sissy, otherwise every girl will wipe her feet on me," he said to himself in his mind. "Besides, right now my main task is to study economics. I want to go into business. And the girls? And the girls later." Leroy diligently chewed on the granite of economics, which turned out to be not so hard. From time to time he had girlfriends, but nothing serious. And I would like to meet the real one, not a cunning shark, who saw in him a promising husband, able to provide his family with a trouble-free life. Leroy graduated from university with a red diploma. A month after the defense, he got a job in a consulting company, and after a year of work went into free sailing. Business was his thing. So why waste time working for his uncle? Leroy's transportation company began to rapidly gain momentum, almost from the beginning of the opening. Having become a rich man by the age of 27, Leroy bought his beloved grandparents a house by the sea for their golden wedding, which they dreamed of. Unfortunately, Grandma was not able to properly enjoy the new home. 6 months after the move, she left this world. Leroy worked a lot, traveled a lot, and enjoyed life. But only dreams of a friendly and strong family remained dreams. And then one day Leroy came to visit his grandfather and, it seems, met the real one. That day he was picking cucumbers, and the young man's attention was attracted by 2 young ladies with model figures. The beauties came to the neighbor's house. Probably the next vacationers came to negotiate the rent of the house, he realized. The brunette didn't make much of an impression on Leroy. In her, at first glance, he could guess a woman who liked spicy adventures, which he had not been interested in for a long time. But the other one, with luxurious hair the color of ripe wheat, without a doubt, she was very beautiful. However, that wasn't what attracted Leroy. The girl's facial expression was dreamy and somehow defenseless. She reminded Leroy of the heroine of children's fairy tales. "You're a storyteller yourself," he shouted to himself. "If she's in contact with a beast like that dark one, then she's the same. And if she's not, her friend will set her straight. So Leroy, you just roll your lip and move on." A couple of days later, Leroy went with his grandfather to a cafe and saw a dark-haired girl in the company of a brutal brunette. Returning from the cafe, the guy decided to walk to the house, which was rented by a neighbor, and saw the light. And 2 days later, Leroy finally convinced himself that the girl of interest spends the evenings in proud solitude while her friend is partying to the full program. And he decided to get acquainted with the golden-haired princess by all means. But how do you do it? The banal "girl, can I meet you?" Definitely not. You meet people here to have a resort romance. And the charming blonde didn't seem to be interested in that. Leroy puzzled for a long time and finally decided to start with a secret courtship. He was returning from the beach and saw the friend of the girl of his dreams on the arm with a brunette. So her friend was single again. Well, it was time to take action. Without thinking long, Leroy cut white roses from his grandfather's garden and rushed to the house the girls were renting. He deliberately did not reveal himself. The dark-haired one would probably think it was for her. Leroy thought with a chuckle, remembering how she had smiled at the men in the market. The next day he decided to find out from his neighbor the surname and first name of the blonde beauty. "Did you like her?" Mrs. Clara winked. "The kindest woman in the world." "I like her," nodded the boy. The next day Leroy saw the neighbor's lodgers going to the restaurant alone. He felt a pang of jealousy, but decided that there was nothing wrong with it. After all, Julia couldn't stay cooped up all vacation. But it seemed that the trip to the restaurant did not go well. The queen of the young businessman's dreams returned from the restaurant quite quickly, and miraculously, she wrote him back, and the next day he had to leave urgently due to a force majeure at the firm. Leroy decided not to cancel the meeting. He instructed his grandfather to meet the guest. And, by all appearances, The old man fulfilled the assignment in the best possible way. When Leroy realized that Julia thought that her grandfather had written to her on behalf of the young man, he burst out laughing. At first I wanted to leave, the guest confessed, but it was like something held me back, and I didn't regret it one bit. You have a great-grandfather. Great-grandfather did all sorts of things. Turns out he used to perform in the circus when he was young, and now he decided to shake his old manhood. Leroy Sr. masterfully juggled apples and showed tricks. And when the merry trio went to the artificial pond in the backyard, he climbed on the railing of the bridge and tried to walk on it. Leroy Jr. and Julia barely managed to catch him. The old man settled down and went to bed, and the young people talked until dawn. You know, you and I have similar destinies, with a smile said Leroy, when Julia told him about his life. Yes, I guess so. She smiled back. I'll see you tomorrow. I'll see you already today. Julia replied and felt like the happiest girl in the world. How was the date? Veronica asked. Don't talk. I can see everything. Are you in love? I think so. Julia nodded. It's better not to show him that. Don't you think I understand that? She sighed. In general, I'll pretend that for me it's just an ordinary resort romance. In the evening, Leroy and Julia went to his favorite restaurant. After dinner, they took a long walk around the village and could not talk for a long time. So began the most beautiful and passionate romance in Julia's life. It's just a pity that this is another way to nowhere. She thought sadly. Oh, come on. Nika waved her hand. At least a week and a half of happiness is yours. So enjoy every cell of your body and soul. Julia, have you thought about family, children? Leroy asked me once. No. Julia shook her head. What am I supposed to say? I'll take everything from life. Then I can think about family. It seems as if she didn't say that, the boy remarked. But then again, Leroy was disappointed, but he didn't show it. Then he thought, that's fine. After all, having a good time with a beautiful girl wasn't bad either. When it was time to leave, Leroy saw Julia off with a huge bouquet of red and white roses. Thank you for the fairy tale, he said. You too, Julia replied. She wanted to cry, and she prayed to God not to do it in the presence of the resort lover. Leroy never said the words she was waiting for. Well, good luck. Leroy spoke deliberately cheerfully. He left. Julia took her seat in the airplane and cried bitterly. She didn't want to believe that this was the end. A month later, Julia realized that a new life had begun inside her. Some of her married friends began to laugh at her when they heard about it. But Julia didn't care, because she would have a child with the man she loved, and everything else didn't matter. The mother-to-be didn't suspect that Leroy was in a bad way. I don't understand what you're worrying about, grandfather said. I would explain myself if I were you. She said that. What did she say? Unceremoniously interrupted my father. You've known each other a week, so why should she tell you about her plans for her life? And then Julia might have been afraid you might have taken her words as a hint. A hint of what? My grandson didn't understand. What do you mean, what? That she wants to get married. She was afraid you'd run away if you got scared. And now what to do? Leroy, are you out of your mind? Grandpa got really angry. If you really cannot without her, then fly to her, say that you love. And if she? I'll kill you. Leroy swung jokingly. Julia walked to her car and suddenly heard a painfully familiar voice calling her. This can't be happening, she thought. But where would he come from? He must have forgotten me by now. Julia, the voice repeated more insistently, and the young woman turned around. Leroy stood behind her and looked at her fondly. Leroy, what brings you here? I'm here for you. I love you. You won't send me away? You've become even more beautiful, said Leroy and looked at her from head to toe. Julia, are you what? He didn't finish, but Julia did it for him. You got me pregnant? And you hid it? How was I supposed to know how you felt about it? Julia exclaimed. You fool. Leroy smiled, hugging her, and whispered, Don't you think we'll have to think of starting a family now? Very much so, she whispered back. Their lips met. In a month. You didn't catch the bouquet at my wedding for nothing. Hannah cheered, genuinely happy for her cousin. No, she didn't go to the resort for nothing, Veronica declared authoritatively. Girls, don't argue. cheerfully said the happy newlywed. Neither of these things went to waste. And I'm happy. Yes, and I did not miss such a nice guest, echoed Leroy. Happiness to the young? Nika exclaimed. Happy young people, echoed the guests.